is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the McMaster Optimal Aging Portal, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening to hear from Dr. Diana Sherifali on how we can achieve our health goals. This is the fourth talk in our series with the Optimal Aging Portal, and it's so great to see so many familiar names on the registration list. You know, in the old days, I'd walk into a room and I'd see smiling faces, and now I just see lots of names. But it's so great that you're all here, and we certainly appreciate your interest and support with these webinars. And for those who are joining us for the first time, I'd like to extend a special welcome and hope you will want to register over and over again for all kinds of different talks that we organize. Before I turn the mic over to Dr. Anthony Levison, who, like always, will be moderating this talk, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which this webinar is taking place here on McMaster's campus is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belted Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link with the recording early next week. If you have any questions for Dr. Sherifali, please feel free to type it in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, and I think it's at the top if you're on an iPad. If you have any technical issues or any questions about the webinar, technical questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Please don't put your questions for Dr. Sherifali in the chat because it's really difficult for Anthony to go between the chat and the Q&A. So that would be great if you could just put it in one location. So now that we have all the housekeeping items out of the way, let's bring Anthony on to introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you, Anthony, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Christine, and welcome everybody. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Diana Sherifali. Diana is an associate professor at McMaster University in the School of Nursing. She is a trained nurse and the inaugural holder of the Heather M. Arthur, PHRI, Hamilton Health Sciences Chair in Interprofessional Health Research at McMaster. She's also the lead for the McMaster Evidence Review and Synthesis team, which produces high-quality evidence-based health reviews. Her research program aims to optimize the management of diabetes and quality of life for older adults and people with diabetes across the lifespan with innovations like coaching and technology-enabled diabetes self-management. And we're really fortunate to have her here tonight to speak with us about some of the work that she's been doing around behavior change and the use of habits for healthy lifestyle behaviors. So without further ado, welcome, Diana, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to listen to my presentation. I'll just start my presentation by sharing the screen here. Okay, wonderful. So I'd like to start with a little bit of an agenda, and that is to really set the stage in terms of the burden of chronic diseases and non-communicable diseases, and why this is relevant to healthy goals or health behavior goals. What is the evidence around health goals, and particularly tiny habits, which is something that I hope to instill and inspire people to engage in. What is a tiny habit, and how would you get started in doing those types of activities? So to set the stage, chronic diseases are known as non-communicable diseases. And obviously, in light of emerging out of the pandemic, we're so used to hearing the term communicable or highly infectious diseases. Non-communicable diseases are things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and also some types of, hypertension, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, other chronic conditions that are not infectious in nature, but carry a lot of burden in terms of mortality and morbidity. So there's a high prevalence of complications and death. And 80% of these non-communicable diseases, in fact, can be prevented or delayed through a combination of addressing certain risk factors. Number one, unhealthy diets. Number two, physical inactivity. Number three, tobacco use. And number four, harmful use of alcohol. So it is a combination of these types of risk factors that can address non-communicable diseases through prevention and management and treatment. One thing we also want to be mindful of is that these risk factors are not just isolated to individual behaviors and people. Rather, they comprise a constellation of biological determinants, behavioral determinants, physical and environmental determinants, and also socio and cultural determinants. So that's something that we just want to be mindful of when we talk about behavior change. So, from the standpoint of the lived experience of someone who's at risk for a chronic condition or non communicable disease or living with a chronic condition, over the past 25 years or so, I've been working with individuals, patients, and studying this topic. And what I've come to realize is that typically people with chronic conditions or those that are at risk for chronic conditions really fall between sort of the continuum of healthcare. So the lived experience is such that you will come to see a healthcare provider, a doctor, a nurse educator, every 3 to 4 months typically. And your healthcare visit might last about 10 to 15 minutes. And in between each visit, you are given a series of messages or tasks to work on. And those messages include take your medications, reduce your risks, such as smoking or your alcohol intake. You may be asked to pay out of pocket for certain things. You may be asked to eat more healthy foods, be more active, monitor your conditions. Maybe it's your blood pressure, your glucose levels, your weight. You're encouraged to problem solve and self manage. Think about what's happening and why things are happening in such a way. Oh, and by the way, cope with your condition, manage your distress and stress levels. So this becomes very, very challenging because we can quickly estimate that upwards of 90% of tasks related to chronic disease management prevention and management is done by the individual outside of the healthcare system. And so, what this really, really highlights is this opportunity to work on health goals or behavior change. And this really has been the crux of my research for the past 12 to 15 years. So, in doing so, let's dig a little bit further into what is that lived experience. So we've come to understand sort of health goals as quote unquote lifestyle goals. And I just want to come out and say, first and foremost, that's really, really sort of lazy language when we talk about lifestyle. Oftentimes, these things or these risk factors are not necessarily choices, but constellations of these other factors, as I mentioned earlier, biology, behavior, social, economic factors that drive behaviors. One thing I've also come to understand is that the dependence on lifestyle, it perpetuates the personal responsibility that it's up to the individual. If only they could control their behaviors, if only they could motivate themselves to change. So it perpetuates this myth of stigma, shame, and quite frankly, self-sabotaging language. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I've cheated. I've fallen off the wagon when it comes to my diet. I'm non-compliant. And this is how they're referring to themselves and articulating vocally that they are non-compliant or they've cheated. From other colleagues, I've heard expressions such as, these patients are unmotivated. How do we motivate them? They're non-adherent. How do we get them to comply with recommendations? So this is also juxtaposed with, how people are feeling about sort of this perpetual myth of personal responsibility. And at the end of the day, I just feel like there was something else going on here. We were not giving people the tools, the supports, and the resources to actually optimize their behaviors and change. And what ultimately happened for me was an aha or epiphany where me as an educator giving people information and ongoing education just wasn't resulting in behavior. And that was a fundamental shift in my thinking. And as a result of that, I decided to embark on a trial. I received funding using a health coach that was trained in a particular approach to address health goals. And the approach was something called tiny habits that I'll get into a little bit further on. So, what we did was we explored the use of a health coach that was trained in tiny habits And we conducted a study of about 365 people that were randomized to usual diabetes education and care approaches, or they could access a health coach. And the health coach they could access once a week for the first 6 months, and then once a month for the following 6 months. This was available to them, and they could use the health coach as they wanted. And what we were trying to assess was, first and foremost, would this make a difference in terms of their diabetes control? So a marker of diabetes control is also known as a glycated hemoglobin, or you'll see here on the slide, A1C. That's sort of the short form. We also assessed people's quality of life. So we thought, if their diabetes control is improving and behaviors are improving, what about their quality of life? And then we also assessed cost effectiveness. And just very briefly, this slide highlights the demographics of our participants. So you can see that they're on average 57, 59 years of age, equally distributed in terms of gender, females and males. Race, again, sort of equal distribution. What was most striking to me was these were individuals who lived with type 2 diabetes for a while, 8, 9 years on average. And they certainly had some room to improve in terms of their diabetes control. Their markers were about 9.1% for the group that got health coaching at baseline, and 8.9% for the group that was randomized to usual care. And as a reference point, the target is actually 7%. So these folks had some room for improvement. And so what we found after a year is both groups decreased their A1C, which is a good thing, and we suspected that would be the case. However, the difference between the two groups after 1 year was a 0.5% reduction in A1C. So this 0.5% reduction is on par with medication. So many times people are prescribed a pill to manage their diabetes that would actually be just as effective and potent as health coaching, and specifically a health coach trained in a particular behavior change model. We also found that people's quality of life improved. And this was quite fascinating to us because we thought, well, even with intensive coaching, intensive behavior change, this is interesting. They felt that they were living a better life as a result of health coaching. And more specifically, we interviewed people to really understand why this might be. Why was this working? And of 15 people that agreed to be interviewed, they told us 4 themes, and these were quite compelling reasons for us that sort of, really resonated. Number 1 was that it supported the adaptation of living well with their diabetes. They felt that they were offered non-judgmental support as they continued on their behavior change journey. It increased their mindfulness of diabetes-related wellness. So what did their life look like beyond just diabetes? It redefined their role and their definition of who they were. And fourth and finally, it was really providing them a guiding framework for behavior change. So during this time, we really started to, consider that we had some compelling, strong evidence for health coaching that used a tiny habits approach. Subsequently, around the same time that we completed our study, we found that more and more literature was being comprised and compiled to also speak to the impact of tiny habits or modifying behavior through small habits. And so this slide just depicts some of the more recent studies that basically summarize the literature, whether it's a single study in older adults, whether it's a review of the literature in terms of healthy habits for weight loss, or healthy habits for home environment change as well. So it was quite interesting to see this actually manifest in the literature as well. So what is a tiny habit? Well, a tiny habit is essentially a small, tiny health behavior that is something that you design, that you want to do, is super quick and fast to do. And many people think that a tiny habit should probably fit anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes tops. It does not require motivation, which is almost like a false way to think about behavior change. and can be done easily and can increase, multiply, and spread as well. So let's consider some of the messages that people have heard over the years. And I've been guilty of this as well as a diabetes nurse educator. I can't think of all the times I've heard, eat healthy, you got to get more active. Why don't you try to lose some weight? Have you thought about losing some weight? Are you taking your medications? Take your pills. Are you testing your glucose or blood pressure levels? Have you thought about decreasing your stress levels? These are all very complex behaviors that require a lot of skills, motivation, aptitudes, resource, whether it's technology and other factors. So they're quite complex and difficult to do. So let's consider simplifying the behavior. So if this is a patient named Charles, and I've basically stated to Charles, I think maybe a goal for you next time between your visits might be to get more active. Charles might start by saying, okay, how do I simplify this complex behavior? So I would actually work with Charles to say, well, Charles, what do you enjoy doing? So if the broad goal is to get more active, at the end of the day, what does that mean to you? What is your aspiration? What is your goal? And be realistic and honest. So for Charles, it might not be, getting more active or losing weight. For Charles, it might be, hey, I want to feel more energetic. And by the way, I hate going to the gym. I hate it when people watch me and judge me. But you know what, Diana? I used to play football. I do have some bad knees, but I don't mind dancing to some good music. Okay, so that's great. That's a way that we've taken a broad goal or broad aspiration in Charles's point, but it's considered and customized to him. It's a bespoke journey of what matters to him. So a tiny habit follows three basic ingredients. One is an anchor or a call to action. Two is the behavior or the B. And then the third part is a celebration. And this is probably the weirdest part of it all, but it gets fun and gets quite exciting. So if we think of an anchor or a call to action, it could be something as simple as when you get up in the morning and you put your coffee pod into your Keurig coffee machine, you close it, you now have a call to action. You've done something, and as a result of doing something, you have triggered a behavior or a tiny habit. So in working with Charles might say, well, after I close that Keurig coffee machine, I'm going to go to a wall and do 20 push-ups. Okay. And maybe the tiny habit of 20 push-ups might even be too big. If you're not used to doing wall push-ups or have a lot of upper body strength, you might start off with 3 wall push-ups. Keep it super tiny, super small. Again, the goal is to fit this tiny behavior or tiny habit within approximately 30 to maybe 30 seconds to about 2 minutes. Once you're done the behavior, you want to celebrate. Celebrate yourself for doing that behavior and enacting on it. And it could be something as you got this or a fist pump. A fun way to think about this for those of you that are listening is what would you do if you pulled out, as you've put away your winter coats and hopefully this winter season ends soon, and you pull out a raincoat or a spring coat and you put your hand in the pocket and you pull out a $20 bill, $20 that you never knew you had. How would you celebrate? Would you say, woohoo? Would you fist pump? Would you, do a little jiggle or whatever? My personal celebration is a sesame snap. When I was in kindergarten, I still remember getting a little snap as job well done, Diana. So that still resonates with me, and it's anchored in emotion. It's positive self-talk, my little sesame snap. So you want to make sure that you add that instant celebration. So going back to Charles, he's now closed his Keurig coffee machine. That's his cue to insert his tiny habit. He's going to go to a wall, do 20 push-ups, and that's his small behavior that supports the larger aspiration or the larger goal of getting moving and feeling more energetic. And again, by instilling and adding that celebration afterwards, it connects your action to emotions. And that's probably the secret sauce in all of this, is connecting behavior to emotions. We do behaviors that feel good. And the more we feel good about ourselves and the behaviors, success begets success. So let's take this a step further and think about what we can do. So why do tiny habits work? Tiny habits work because on many fronts, they're designed specifically for you, by you. It fits into your daily routine or schedule, and it should ultimately be seamless. So many tiny habits are anchored or triggered by things that you already do. Could be sitting at your desk. Whenever your phone rings, you practice 3 deep breaths. Take nice deep breaths to sort of calm and situate yourself, and then answer your phone. So it should fit seamlessly into your routine. Eventually, because of the anchors that are happening in your routine, these behaviors ultimately become indistinguishable. So in other words, they don't just pop out. You kind of do them automatically without even thinking about it. They become seamless, repeatable on autopilot. The biggest piece here that I really have enjoyed and sort of come to realize is that it doesn't actually rely on motivation. These habits and these behaviors are so small, they're so ridiculously easy to do that even if you're not feeling 100%, and if Charles, instead of doing 20 push ups, his starting goal was to do 5, if he's feeling a little under the weather, he can still do his 5 push ups and celebrate the fact that he did it. But over time, doing that repeated behavior and celebrating that locks in the tiny habit. It builds self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is that self-belief or confidence that you can do this particular behavior. And building on that self-confidence and efficacy is that you can start to think about other habits that can grow, but you can also stack additional habits. So if Charles is waiting for the Keurig machine, he's done his 20 push-ups, and those 20 push-ups, he's getting pretty quick and fast at it. Now he's added maybe 10 squats. So in a period of maybe 1 minute, he's done 20 push-ups, 10 squats, and what else can he be doing in terms of stacking, but also looking for other opportunities to add additional push-ups along the way or squats. Now, a word about motivation. So motivation is basically like riding a wave. And again, motivation is great if you've got it, but if you've got it, ride it and use it to its maximum effect. If you don't have it, your tiny habit is so tiny that you won't feel discouraged or disgruntled or sort of defeated if you didn't get your tiny habit in. It's small and tiny, 3 push-ups, 5 push-ups, it's easy to do. So if you have an increase in motivation, ride it. And what we mean by that is take that opportunity to increase your training or access to other things. So what Charles might do is instead of just doing wall push-ups, maybe he starts to add some weights, or maybe he actually goes to the floor and trains in how to do proper sort of, floor push-ups. The other thing he might do is improve his environment. So instead of doing modified push-ups, he might add, additional weights, bands, that sort of thing. Another way to think about riding the wave is improving the organization of where you might be doing those activities. So it might be in the kitchen, he may be reorganizing his kitchen so that he's having more and more opportunities to thread in healthy habits around perhaps healthy eating. So additional habits that are stacking and making sense. Coffee, breakfast, healthy eating, doing some wall push-ups, that sort of thing. So ride the wave. So how does one get started? And again, I know we've talked about this being super tiny, small habits. I want you to really think first and foremost about what is the overarching goal and what is your aspiration. So one of the challenges I've had over the years, and which has really led me into health coaching in particular, is that it's a bit of that care translation from visit to visit. What is it that people want? What is it that individuals aspire and value? So yes, as healthcare providers, we might say, we need to improve markers of diabetes control or disease control. But really, truly, what's important to our patients or individuals living with or at risk for chronic conditions? Is it, I want to stay mobile. I want to stay as healthy as possible for my grandkids. I want to see my son or daughter get married. What is that goal? What is that broader aspiration? And once you've identified what that means for you, think about and explore and design some of those small behaviors that are associated with that overarching goal. So, if the goal is to lose weight and get more active, think creatively. What are some of those smaller goals that you can do? Is it the fact that you like to dance, you like music, but you're not going to start taking dancing lessons right now. Maybe the time's not right. It's expensive. You don't have a dancing partner. But what can you do? Is it a matter of, putting on a favorite song and dancing for 2.5 minutes while the song's playing, or 3 minutes? Start tiny. So 3 push-ups may seem trivial, but over time, those 3 push-ups then add to, 10 push-ups, 15 push-ups, or those tiny 3 push-ups start to get stacked with other behaviors along the way. The other key point to get started to consider is finding a good prompt, and that's that anchor or that call to action. We tend to be creatures of habit. So mornings are often a really good time to think about some of your tiny habits. Another good time is turning on the shower. When you turn on the shower, you usually have about 10, 15 seconds for hot water to come through the pipes. So what can you do in those 10, 15 seconds? Is it a couple squats? Again, is it wall push-ups? Is it 3 deep cleansing breaths to sort of situate yourself for the day? Today's going to be a good day. Today's going to be a positive day. I look forward to the day, whatever your mantra is, and then proceed. Don't forget to celebrate. That's the fist pump, the sesame snap, whatever gives you joy and confirms in your own mind that sort of positive first step. Celebrating is about self-care, self-efficacy, and building that sort of positive psychology and growth in yourself. And reflect and grow. Grow those tiny habits, reflect what's working, reflect on what's not working. So in terms of other supports that you can use to help facilitate tiny habits, we talk about using technology. So this has also been another area of my research as well. How can technology support? Well, again, when your motivation is high, you're curious, you're building on new skills, you can start to reorganize your environment. It could be something as simple as looking at your computer screen and looking at how can Microsoft Outlook or my schedule on Apple devices prompt me. So you can use prompts, wearable devices, equipment, watches, whatever it might be, to sort of trigger that call to action. It could be a little alarm every 50 minutes. If you're sitting at a desk, the prompt goes off and you now have 2 minutes to do something fun. Arm circles, squats, wall push-ups, put on a song and just dance to it, whatever it is that you feel like doing. And now, if the tiny habit doesn't stick, for whatever reason, you keep forgetting to do it, or you don't have the time, or it might just be, it's just not sticking. You're not being able to do it. Don't fret, don't worry. This is essentially your story to tell. So it's about going back and thinking about, what are my ABCs? So is the anchor working? And sometimes there's a disconnect between what you're trying to do in terms of the behavior and the actual call to action. So for example, if it's an anchor or a trigger through Outlook and I'm at work, it might not be an optimal time to turn on music and start dancing, but it could be an opportunity where I might stand up, do a couple stretches, go for a little bit of a walk, do some arm circles, 2-3 minutes, I'm back at my desk. Okay, so consider why this might not be sticking. Is it the anchor? Is it the behavior too big? Or, is it the fact that you're not celebrating? You're not reminding yourself to stay positive and congratulating yourself. So reflect, redesign what that tiny habit might be, and just keep trying. It's an iterative process. There's no failure. How do you grow your tiny habits? Repetition is key. Keep repeating it until it becomes a routine, until you forget to even think about it. You start doing it automatically. And when you start doing it automatically, you're not even thinking about the trigger or the anchor. And you might not actually even be celebrating anymore because it's become so ingrained in what you're doing. Oftentimes, too, people will grow by planting more tiny habits. So if you have a habit with the Keurig coffee maker, maybe you've got another habit around, when you leave the house, when you start your car, other sort of triggers that may call in additional tiny habits. Feel free to stack your habits. So again, if you've got some extra time, push-ups with squats, arm circles, if you're getting up, using Outlook as a prompt, arm circles, some squats, you might have some weights. There's some weights in the back here if in my background. Start stacking additional habits together. Ride the motivation wave. So don't let it be the end of a behavior. If you don't have a lot of motivation, you always have the tiny habit to fall back on. 3 push-ups, 5 push-ups, whatever it might be. But if you have a high period of motivation, use it to kind of organize your space, get some resources, and just, stack yourself and build yourself up for success. And finally, believe in yourself, because I think for far too long, we've seen sort of the unintended consequences of not achieving health goals. People will come in every 3 months simply saying, I haven't been able to get active, I haven't been able to do this. But what's a real shift in this paradigm is people coming in saying, I've created these really cool habits. Look at what I'm doing. Throughout the day, I've done 20 wall push-ups, 50 squats, and they've sort of tallied up all of the physical activity that they've done or other lifestyle modification. So in conclusion, health goals, I think, are just far, quite frankly, too broad, too complex, require too much motivation and too much ability or a complexity in that standpoint. Tiny habits, it's emerging in terms of an evidence-based approach. Again, it's one more tool in the toolkit that we have to support people in making behavior change. It helps solve for some of these more complex, challenging behavior puzzles. They can be quite fun and creative, particularly in working with people as they start to find the anchors and those tiny habits. It increases one's self-efficacy and their confidence in how well they feel, their self-confidence and how well they feel. And from a nurse researcher interested in chronic disease management and prevention, we certainly see some of the long-term health benefits of sustainable long-term tiny habits over time, particularly in markers of disease control, quality of life, and ultimately in healthcare utilization. So I want to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was an excellent overview of kind of an exciting area. We've had some questions coming in, and we've also had questions that were posed previously. So I'll try to get to them, but it was interesting. One of the questions that came in, it was a comment just saying that somebody at Weight Watchers, and the theme of this month was actually about reinforcing habits. So I was saying in the chat, there's still a difference, I think, between sort of reinforcing positive habits, trying to break bad habits, and the tiny habit concept, which I think is a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the real opportunity is not so much focused on breaking bad habits or changing of addictions and that sort of thing. It's really around creating these opportunities, these sparks, these moments in time where again there's a call to action. Something as simple as putting your toothbrush back. Once you put your toothbrush back, that's a prompt where, I can pick up some floss and floss one tooth. Again, it sounds ridiculous, but if that's something that someone is adopting every single day, that can grow and rides and ebbs and flows with motivation. It could be something as flossing teeth, eating more broccoli, adding more activity. So again, instilling small positive behaviors, growing positive behaviors, and not so much breaking bad habits.
That's great. So you spoke about the role of a health coach, health coaching, diabetes coaching, and some of your work.
Mm-hmm.
And a few of the questions that came in. So one was about a life coach. And I think this ties in with another question that's come in around, is Health Coach a sort of formal program? Are there formal programs that people can kind of access? And another question as well about whether there were any no-cost or low-cost sources of health coaching. So maybe just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so health coaching is something that, again, I've sort of been working on and researching probably in the last 10 years or so. What I will say is health coaching and life coaching, to me, those are completely different. Uh, Both are unprotected titles. So, in other words, anyone can call themselves a life coach, anyone can call themselves a health coach. The distinction for me and for a lot of people is that health coaching is actually offered through academic or continuing education institutions. So, McMaster University has some continuing ed courses on health coaching. I myself, I've had the pleasure and opportunity to create the health, lead the chronic disease health coaching certificate program at the Health Coach Institute at York University, just on the other side of the Golden Horseshoe. So from that standpoint, you want to be careful. So just be sort of a smart and critical consumer. Consider what the credentials are. A health coach in our particular program at the Health Coach Institute really falls into two sort of buckets. The first bucket is about lifestyle health and wellness. And the folks that come into that particular program may not be regulated healthcare professionals, but these might be folks that have an interest or have some skills or training in sort of health and wellness, community support, that sort of thing. So we've had police officers, teachers, um, personal trainers from, say, Good Life Health and Fitness places. They'll go into sort of the health and wellness health coaching program. Regulated healthcare professionals then go to sort of the augmented next level, and that's the chronic disease health coaching certificate program. So there needs to be a regulatory credentialed body that gives them their licensing, and that protects the public, reassures everyone that their skills, knowledge, competencies to, sort of enact in their professional designation, but also they can take on the role of health coaches and those skills required. The third piece that is still sort of being developed and is of keen interest, and I have some colleagues that are doing some of this work and leading this work, is around peer coaching. So peer health coaches is a new and exploding sort of area, particularly in low and middle income countries where health is often provided by non-traditional healthcare workers like community health workers and that sort of thing. So I think if someone is interested in exploring that avenue, I would just be, a critical consumer, look at their training, their expertise. Are they a regulated healthcare professional? Those are the sorts of things that I would start to explore if someone I knew was looking to pursue that.
To your knowledge, does McMaster, you talked about the McMaster continuing education program, is that for learning how to become a health coach? Are there any programs related to sort of tiny habits for older adults who, like, in other words, people who might want to access either no cost or low cost coaching or some kind of other program related to tiny habits?
Yeah, so I think there's a myriad of resources in terms of books and websites. So I think some of the websites will be posted. Again, they're very broad in terms of the goals. So what we talked about was getting active. So that's a broad goal. How do you crystallize that into a tiny habit? So there's a lot of books and resources. Some of the sort of New York Times bestsellers have been Tiny Habits, the book by BJ Fogg, Atomic Habits. So and oftentimes with these books, there's some resources and worksheets that you can work through. The lovely thing about anything small and tiny is that, we don't worry about injuries or risk or harms. These are small little behaviors that if you can just add on to them, over time, they, manifest into sort of larger behaviors. So it could be a tiny habit is walking for 5 minutes. So I might get up from my desk, walk through my, main entrance, kitchen, do a lap around the table and come back. So this isn't anything big, onerous. I wouldn't necessarily say that you need health coaching to facilitate, implement and optimize tiny habits or small habits. I wouldn't say so, but be on the lookout. Sometimes there's programs offered through, YMCA community services where they may be offering opportunities to optimize and actually participate in programs that can really mimic a tiny habit approach. But the spirit of tiny habits is it's small, quick, easy. You should be able to do it anywhere. So, I'll challenge you, Anthony, next time you're off on a conference presenting your research, you get to a new hotel room or conference center, take a look at your environment and think, where can I put in a tiny habit? If it's brushing your teeth, after you brush your teeth, you're going to go do 5 wall push-ups or something to that effect.
Well,
But again,
your example of the three push-ups, I was like, that's your tiny habit. Push-ups are hard.
wall push-ups.
Wall push-ups. Okay. There have been a few comments. So I'll just say in the chat, we've added some of the resources that Diana was referring to, including the BJ Fogg book. Some of the participants have also pointed out, if you're familiar with TED, the TED Talks and TED.com, there's also a BJ Fogg TED Talk that talks about the same concept around the tiny habits. There's a few people talking about weight loss as a goal, and that was a question that came in. And I guess one of the questions is, is weight loss too complex, or can you maybe give us some examples of what might be tiny habits related to weight loss that somebody could kind of get started with?
Yeah, so again, weight loss is a very complex goal for a number of reasons. Social, structural determinants of health, biology, other comorbid conditions that people might be living with. Is it a consequence or side effect of medications that people are taking? So again, it's kind of like taking that broad health goal, weight loss, and that might be a goal that's sort of a message that's been delivered to you as an individual over time. You've heard it from other healthcare providers, or it could be, let's face it, sometimes our families giving us this advice. But what does that look like? What does that mean for you? Is it the fact that you want to have more energy? You want to fit into clothes a little bit better? Let's face it, we've all gone through COVID where, unfortunately, we haven't been as active or moving and engaging in activities that we normally would. So, we've maybe put on a little bit of weight. So to that end, again, what might facilitate that? So it's a broad goal, and start to create kind of the constellation of behaviors. Is it that, I'm snacking a little bit? Is it that, I'm not moving as much as I used to? And sometimes it is that painful exercise of reflecting and just being super honest with yourself. Okay. Self-discovery, self-journey, journaling, reflecting, all of that stuff. And then just start small. It might mean that you have a cutoff point. If you snack at night, is there a trigger for snacking? So is it, when I sit at night, I get cozy and comfy on the couch, and then I just get hungry. I feel peckish for something. So if it's chips or something else, a salty, crunchy snack, is there a tiny habit that you can substitute there? Not saying quit cold turkey, but is there another thing that you can do? So rather than getting the box of crackers, is it a dish and putting some crackers in the dish and then taking that with you? Is it substituting the anchor or that call to have the snack with something else? As soon as you have that, oh, I'm feeling peckish, I want to go get a snack, is that where you can do a quick little physical activity call to action, a little behavior? So you can start to substitute kind of the behavior of weight loss with some healthy eating habits, but then also some physical activity, healthy behavior habits. So it's really, in that circumstance, weight loss, you really want to sort of pull at the thread of what does that look like? What might that look like? And I think, quite frankly, the easiest approach is always start to think about behavior around moving, get people moving. And so, building tiny habits, whether it's push-ups, walking, squats, weights, arm circles. And again, then that success in those tiny habits just builds and builds and builds. And then you'll start to notice some changes in other aspects.
Yeah, I can see there is a certain art, I think, to actually identifying the goals and creating the tiny habit, isn't there? It's almost when I would meet with patients and try to create a behavioral hierarchy as part of things like cognitive behavioral therapy. Sometimes it's hard for people to access
Yeah.
their goals or develop those habits. So I can imagine that there could be a valuable role in the health coaching side to help people formulate appropriate kind of tiny habits and the goals, because it's not always easy to set those goals. And I think even from a lot of the questions coming in, they are complex, right? They're these big complex behaviors like losing weight or getting control of diabetes or so
Yeah.
I think there's value in helping people to formulate these tiny habits, right? The goals themselves.
Yeah. And I just want to add, like, I think that's really a missed opportunity, um, from the standpoint of healthcare providers, right? It's that middle time, from health visit to health visit. If you are living with or at risk for a chronic condition, there's so much onus on the individual to help manage, help self-support, self-manage, self-support, that sort of thing. So we've lost the messaging along the way that, to me, it's almost felt like we've abandoned patients, to be brutally honest. It's almost like an abdication of care. We've taught you everything you need to know in your classes, whatever it might be. Now go self-manage, go cope, go adjust your lifestyle, go do this, take
Yeah,
your medications.
we are not very precise about prescribing exercise and diet.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very, eat healthy, move more.
Yep.
There's a couple of questions that have come in around, are there approaches or things that might help people who either have some form of cognitive cognitive issues, cognitive impairment, or so they have problems maybe remembering some of their goals or keeping on track if there's a cue for their habit. And then similarly, there was somebody who wrote in who has ADHD. So any suggestions for people who might need some additional accommodation or support to keep track of their habits?
Yeah, I would probably say that in this case, I would use technology and try to thread in technology for those reminders or those prompts or call to action. So if it could be where, they may be supported with family or caregivers where, a couple times throughout the day, every hour, every couple of hours, there's an alarm or an alert of some sort, and there's a clear instruction, do 20 arm circles, or at this hour, this is the call to action. So the reminder, the prompt may be automated from that standpoint. But then with technology, you can actually write out what the tiny habit is. Then it might mean, a little bit more sort of complexity in terms of helping support people as they, confirm that they've done it, but it's sort of a reciprocal kind of, yay, you did it, good work. Unfortunately, you really can't automate that. We've seen tech do that where, you get up and you've achieved your 10,000 steps for the day, your phone will, or your watch buzzes and you get fireworks on your watch and you feel good about it. So, again, some of that can be automated, but, that's something that you might want to just explore a little bit further and look for opportunities to use tech.
I want my legit Sesame Snap.
Yeah, I know.
The other suggestion that we sometimes will give for people with cognitive impairment is to use old-fashioned sticky notes. So your
Yes.
example before, where there might be, you know, a behavior cued by the closing of the coffee maker, well, you could have a sticky note
Yeah.
with your tiny habit, you know, placed in the area where, you know, you're going to encounter it. So if it's,
Yeah.
you know, on the washing machine or on a, but you could potentially write out the habit if you needed a refresher.
Absolutely. Yep.
So here was another comment around the challenge of maintenance, and maybe you could say a little bit more that, you know, some people might have had a real change in their behaviors during the pandemic, and maybe even then like develop new goals, tiny habits during the pandemic. And now that they're back at work, it's sort of hard to maintain the habits that were there before. So maybe just in this context, I guess, is you might develop habits, but then your circumstances change or the context changes, which might present challenges for maintenance. Any thoughts around how to sort of manage something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So oftentimes when we think about behavior and what triggers a big behavior change, it's usually one of three things. One is it's an epiphany, something has really, really changed in your life. Sometimes it could be, a diagnosis of something, and that's kind of, fear is motivating that behavior change. The second is, again, sort of a clustering of tiny habits, these small little shifts in behavior that have accumulated. The third thing that can drive and change behaviors in terms of, are you still maintaining it, is to your point, Anthony, where there's been a change in the environment. Something has happened. So I kind of joked about, you being away at a conference. Okay, great. Something has changed for those that, 3, 4, or 5 days. But, hopefully when you get back into sort of your routine and environment, you pick up on the tiny habits. Now, the beauty of tiny habits is that you then just redesign. So again, it would probably require some reflection to say, okay, I'm no longer doing this. Why might that be? Is it the environment has changed, the anchor, the call to action? So if you're back to work, is the Keurig coffee machine still there? Are you still making coffee in the morning? And it might mean you take that extra time, make the coffee at home, or are you getting coffee at work? So are you waiting somewhere for coffee at work? Some of these work environments have almost like a kitchenette for themselves now. Is there a Keurig coffee machine where you can adopt a new behavior there? So it's really, again, sort of taking kind of a pause to reflect about, why isn't the behavior sticking? Why isn't that habit sticking? And it's not so much like, oh, I've failed. I've fallen off the wagon. I didn't achieve my goal. It just means that you need to sort of reflect, pause, and think, what's happened? What's shifted? Is that anchor gone, the call to action? But if it is there an opportunity to find new calls to action, right?
Yeah,
Are there stairs? Yeah,
that's
stairs,
a
elevator buttons.
great
Yeah.
example. And I think one of our team members, they used to park quite far and walk into the workplace. When we were working remotely, they built in the same walk, even though because they were no longer walking from parking lot to university. So they
Right.
built in that same routine that had been beneficial before. So yeah, not always easy, as you said, depends on the context, and some of the environmental and time factors may have shifted, but
And that's I always think of it as, it's always an opportunity to learn. So I think that's probably the biggest benefit of doing this exercise, is that you're actually learning and kind of unpacking what's working for you. So keeping it small, keeping it tiny, and really understanding where are those anchors, whether it's at work, at home. What is your morning routine like? What is your night routine like? I've had various colleagues use tiny habits just to even start their day, start their routines, or as they go to sleep, when they turn off their night light, they say something positive to themselves. It's been a tough day, but I'm grateful for A, B, C. And that's kind of how they finish their day. So I always think there's opportunities to sort of reflect and think where you can map out and plant some extra tiny habits.
We're going to wrap up soon, but there's been a few questions that have come in, and I think this is a really interesting comment question. Any suggestions with regards to the relationship between stress and maintaining tiny habits? And I think the example they give is sometimes there's like stress eating, and I think a lot of habits, maybe less healthy habits or things, can be tied in with stress, but certainly eating, diet, things like that. So any literature on that relationship, or any suggestions about ways to kind of maintain your equipoise?
Yeah. That's certainly emerging. But I think based on kind of the spirit of tiny habits and how this can work in terms of your emotional, spiritual, physical well-being is, the stress eating, the eating is a symptom of something other than food, right? So it's kind of how we're coping, how we're soothing our emotions. So if anything, it might mean, again, sort of pulling at that thread, like, what is this stress about? Where is the stress coming from? Is it working too much? Is it needing to take time away from the computer, step aside? Is it coping on another level? So it may mean starting very small with, uh, some deep breathing exercises once an hour, right? To kind of address the stress, not so much the eating, but really upstream thinking. What is causing the stress to begin with? And again, that might take some time and some self-reflection.
Yeah, and I think many of these complex health behaviors do not have an easy solution.
No.
So the notion that you might, start with a tiny habit, as you said, in one domain of the problem, and then maybe gradually build or pick other spots and sort of grow those, makes sense. So.
Mhm.
Well, I just want to reiterate, because a couple of people have said there were challenges copying the hyperlinks that were posted in the chat. We will be sending a follow-up when the presentation recording, which will also have some of the links and resources. We will also publish the recording on the McMaster Optimal Aging portal. I want to just take a quick moment to, if you're not familiar with the portal, McMasterOptimalAging.org. You can access videos on there. You can subscribe to the weekly email alerts and be alerted of our next event and any of our e-learning, as well as evidence-based blogs and other content. We have the video posts, so our previous webinars are also available. And so we'll be posting the recording of this webinar on the portal, along with many of the evidence-based resources and citations that Diana mentioned, because that was a question that had come through as well. There's also access to our e-learning lessons, and we have our latest one on delirium that was just published a couple of weeks ago, in case you missed it. The video posts, including a great series with Diana on pre-diabetes and diabetes and lifestyle management as well, that'll be added to our portal YouTube channel. So Diana, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, and thank the portal and the Alumni Association for hosting us again. And as mentioned, you'll get a follow-up email with the link to the webinar and some of the other resources as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.